World-famous bedtime stories from Mom. Today's story is Snow White. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there was a princess as pure and as white as snow. Her name was Snow White. Snow White lost her mother at a very young age. Thus, the kingdom was filled with sorrow. One day, the king welcomed a beautiful queen from a neighboring country. The new queen was very beautiful, but her heart was very wicked. The queen had a very special object in her room. It was a talking magic mirror. This mirror could tell who was the most beautiful person in the world. Every morning, the queen stood in front of the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror always answered, "You are the fairest in the land." The queen was very pleased to hear the mirror's answer. She was happy every time she was told she was the most beautiful in the world. Snow White grew more beautiful day by day. Her skin was as white as snow. Her lips were like red roses, and her hair was as beautiful as the dark night sky. "Snow White, what would you like to do today?" the palace maids always asked her. But Snow White preferred spending time in the garden full of flowers rather than in the splendid palace. One day, when Snow White was singing with the flowers in the garden, little birds gathered around her. "Let's sing together, friends." Snow White enjoyed her time with the birds. Snow White's heart was as beautiful as her appearance. She was kind to everyone, and the palace staff loved Snow White very much. Today, the queen asked the mirror again, "Mirror, mirror, who is the fairest of them all?" But today, the mirror gave a different answer. "Queen, you are fair, it's true, but Snow White is even fairer than you." The queen couldn't believe what she heard and asked again, "What? Is that true?" "Yes, my queen, it's the truth. Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen's face turned red with anger. Jealousy and rage filled her heart. "Snow White is fairer than me. I will never accept that." The queen's heart was filled with rage and jealousy. She decided to get rid of Snow White, who threatened her beauty. So, the queen called the most trusted huntsman to her. "Huntsman, I have a very important task for you. Take Snow White to the forest and eliminate her." The huntsman was shocked to hear the queen's command. "But, my queen, Snow White is the treasure of our kingdom. How could I? If you do not follow my orders, you too will face death," the queen shouted. The huntsman had no choice but to take Snow White to the forest. But his heart was heavy and conflicted. He knew very well that Snow White was always kind and warm-hearted. On the way to the forest, Snow White cheerfully talked and walked with the huntsman. She admired the beauty of the forest, asking various questions to the huntsman. However, the huntsman was torn between the queen's command and his compassion for Snow White. "How could I harm such a pure and beautiful child?" the huntsman whispered to himself. Finally, when they reached deep into the forest, the huntsman made his decision. "Snow White, I cannot harm you. The queen ordered me to eliminate you, but I cannot do it." The huntsman released Snow White and helped her escape safely. Then he decided to lie to the queen. To deceive the queen, the huntsman killed a deer in the forest and took its heart to the queen. The queen believed that the heart was Snow White's. Snow White ran into the forest. Her heart was filled with fear, but her feet would not stop. "Where should I go?" Snow White whispered to herself. The surroundings grew darker. and the forest felt strange and scary. But Snow White gathered her courage and kept walking. "Don't be afraid, Snow White. You can do it," she encouraged herself and moved forward. While walking, Snow White encountered various animals, little rabbits, fluttering butterflies, and singing birds. They did not shy away from Snow White but rather followed her. "Did you all lose your way, too?" Snow White asked her animal friends. The animals could not answer, but their eyes gave Snow White comfort. The forest was vast and complicated. Snow White had to avoid thorn bushes and climb over large rocks. She was tired and hungry, but she did not give up and continued walking. As night fell, the forest became an even scarier place. Strange sounds echoed in the darkness, and Snow White did not know what awaited her, but she rested for a moment under a large tree, looking at the stars. "All of this will end. I will find a way," Snow White resolved under the starlight. As Snow White wandered through the forest, suddenly, a small house appeared before her eyes. "Wow! Who lives here?" Snow White wondered and cautiously approached the house. The house looked very cozy and tidy from the outside. Snow White gently knocked on the door, but there was no answer. "Is anyone there?" Snow White asked again, but it remained silent. Curious, Snow White slowly opened the door and entered. What she found was surprisingly lovely. A small table with 7 small plates, cups, and spoons were set. "Who on earth lives here?" Snow White mumbled to herself. She looked around, admiring everything. Everything was so neatly arranged. There were 7 small chairs, even 7 small beds. Snow White was exhausted from her long journey. She carefully sat on one of the beds and, feeling too comfortable, she lay down. "Let's just rest my eyes for a moment," Snow White thought. Shortly after, Snow White fell into a deep sleep. She felt at peace, having found a safe place away from the dangers of the forest. The 7 dwarfs were returning from mining gold in the mountains that day. After working all day, they were heading back to their small house. "Good work today," the dwarfs encouraged each other as they entered their home. But as soon as they stepped inside, they felt something was different. "Someone has been here. Look, there are traces on the table where the plates were used," the first dwarf said. "And here, someone used my bed," the second dwarf exclaimed in surprise. All 7 dwarfs began checking their beds and belongings. Then, they discovered Snow White sleeping in the bed at the very back. "Wow, who is this?" The dwarfs were surprised and looked at each other. Snow White was sleeping beautifully, and her peaceful face melted all the dwarfs' hearts. "She's such a beautiful lady," the third dwarf whispered. "But how did she get here?" The fourth dwarf wondered. The dwarfs decided not to wake Snow White. "Let's wait until the lady wakes up. We can hear the whole story when she's awake," the fifth dwarf suggested. So, the dwarfs quietly gathered around Snow White, waiting for her to wake up. They watched the lovely Snow White sleeping peacefully. When Snow White gently opened her eyes, she found 7 pairs of curious eyes surrounding her. "Where am I?" Snow White asked cautiously. "We are 7 dwarfs mining gold in the mountains," the first dwarf answered. "But how did you come here?" Snow White told the dwarfs her story, one by one. After she finished, the dwarfs all felt sympathy for Snow White. "It could be dangerous for you to stay here," the second dwarf said worriedly. "But don't worry, We will help you." Thus, Snow White and the 7 dwarfs decided to live together. The dwarfs taught Snow White how to help with household chores, and every day when the dwarfs returned from work, Snow White prepared a delicious dinner for them. "Snow White, with you here, our home has become much brighter," the 3rd dwarf said. The dwarfs loved listening to Snow White's songs and stories. Snow White also became accustomed to life with the dwarfs. She deeply appreciated that the dwarfs treated her like family. "Thank you all for becoming my new family," Snow White said. So, Snow White and the 7 dwarfs helped each other and spent joyful times together. Their home was always filled with laughter and happiness. The queen stood in front of the mirror once again and asked, "Mirror, mirror, who is the fairest of them all?" But the mirror's answer was different from what the queen expected. "Queen, you are fair, it's true, but Snow White, who lives with the 7 dwarfs in the forest, is the fairest of them all." The queen trembled with rage. "Snow White is still alive? I must eliminate her myself." She began plotting a new plan for revenge. The queen decided to disguise herself so that no one could recognize her. She searched her old wardrobe for clothes and accessories that would make her look like a witch. "With these clothes and this mask, no one will recognize me," the queen whispered as she began changing her appearance. She also wore a worn scarf to cover her hair and a large hat to cover her face. Standing in front of the mirror, the queen checked her disguise. "Now, I look like a perfect old woman. Snow White will never recognize me." With the poisoned apple in her basket, the queen disguised as an old peddler headed towards the dwarf's house. She waited for the dwarfs to leave the house, and for a chance to encounter Snow White. Arriving at the dwarf's house, the queen called out in a kind voice, "Apples for sale." Delicious apples. Snow White was initially cautious but was tempted by the apple the queen offered. "That apple looks really delicious." "Yes, my dear. This apple is special. Just one bite, and you'll feel the happiest in the world." The queen lied, seducing Snow White. Snow White hesitated but eventually was deceived by the queen's words, and accepted the apple. As soon as she bit into the apple, the poison spread through her body, and she collapsed. The queen celebrated her success and left the forest. "Now, Snow White will no longer threaten my beauty." The queen entered the forest with a beautiful comb poisoned. "This comb will deceive Snow White. She won't be able to resist this beautiful comb." Knowing the dwarfs were away, the queen approached their house and knocked on the door. Snow White opened the door to find a kind-looking old woman standing before her. "Hello, grandmother. Can I help you with something?" "Oh, my dear, I'm a merchant traveling to sell this beautiful comb. It would suit you perfectly." The queen, disguising her voice, showed the comb to Snow White. Snow White was enchanted by the beauty of the comb. "It's really beautiful, grandmother. But my dear, this is a gift for you. Try it." The queen pretended to be kind and handed the comb to Snow White. Snow White, finding it hard to refuse, accepted the comb and started to comb her beautiful hair. The moment the poisoned comb touched Snow White's hair, she fell to the ground. The queen, cheering inwardly, escaped from the forest. "Now, Snow White will no longer be a threat to my beauty." When the 7 dwarfs returned from mining gold and found Snow White lying on the floor, they were shocked and hurried to her side. "Snow White, are you okay?" the first dwarf asked worriedly, but Snow White showed no sign of response. Then, the second dwarf discovered the strange comb stuck in Snow White's hair. "There's something here. Look at this comb," he shouted to the others. The dwarfs carefully removed the comb, and at that moment, Snow White slowly began to regain consciousness. Everyone, how did I get here?" The dwarfs helped Snow White sit up and explained what had happened. "Snow White, you were in danger. This comb was coated with poison." Snow White was surprised and thanked the dwarfs. "If it weren't for you, I would have been in great trouble." Afterward, the dwarfs warned Snow White. "Snow White, don't let anyone in from now on, especially when we're not around. Understand?" Snow White listened carefully to the dwarfs and promised to be more cautious. "I understand, my dwarf friends. I will listen to you and ensure that no more dangerous incidents happen." The queen learned that her first attempt had failed, but she did not give up and devised a more cunning plan. "This time, I will not fail. I must eliminate Snow White once and for all." She decided to use a poisoned apple this time. The queen went to her alchemy room and injected the most potent poison into the apple. She made one side of the apple appear poison-free to deceive Snow White. After poisoning the apple, the queen disguised herself once again, even more carefully changing her appearance so that no one could recognize her. "With this appearance, Snow White won't recognize me." The queen, carrying the poisoned apple in a basket and disguised as an old peddler, headed to the dwarf's house. She waited for the moment when the dwarfs were away to encounter Snow White. Upon arriving at the dwarf's house, the queen shouted in a kind voice, "Apples for sale." Delicious apples. Snow White was initially cautious, but the apple offered by the queen was too tempting. "That apple looks really delicious." "Yes, my dear, this apple is special. Just one bite, and you'll feel the happiest in the world." The queen lied, seducing Snow White. Snow White hesitated but eventually was deceived by the queen's words and accepted the apple. As soon as she took a bite, the poison coursed through her body, and she fell down. The queen smiled satisfactorily and left the forest. "Now, Snow White will no longer be a threat to my beauty." The moment Snow White bit into the poisoned apple, her eyes began to close. She fell to the ground and fell into a deep sleep. It was such a deep sleep that Snow White could not wake up from. It seemed like she had fallen into an eternal sleep. When the dwarfs returned home in the evening and found Snow White lying on the floor, they rushed to her side, shocked. "Snow White, are you okay?" they exclaimed in worry. Despite their efforts, Snow White did not wake up. Their home was filled with sorrow and concern. "What has happened? Why is Snow White like this?" The dwarfs noticed the partially eaten apple and said, "This apple must have been poisoned. Snow White must have eaten it and fallen into this state." The dwarfs did their best for Snow White. They made her comfortable and continued praying for her to wake up, but Snow White remained in a deep sleep. As days passed, the dwarfs' hearts grew heavier. They were afraid of losing their beloved Snow White. "We hope our dear Snow White will return to us soon." In the middle of the forest, in a place where time seemed to stand still, Snow White lay peacefully inside a glass coffin made with care by the 7 dwarfs. Her face was peaceful, and despite being in a sleep of death, she still seemed to breathe, as beautiful as ever. One day, a prince traveling through the forest stumbled upon this place and fell in love at first sight with Snow White, who had skin as white as snow, lips as red as rubies, and hair as deep as the coal. Drawn to her beauty, the prince unconsciously approached the glass coffin and, out of love and awe, left a gentle kiss on Snow White's pale forehead. At that moment, something magical happened. The prince's pure love, conveyed through his kiss, broke the curse of the poisoned apple. Suddenly, Snow White's heart began to beat softly, and life returned to her cheeks as she slowly awakened from her deep sleep. Taking her first deep breath and opening her eyes, Snow White locked eyes with the prince, and at that moment, they both fell in love at first sight. The prince, with tears of joy, confessed his love to Snow White. "Snow White, I love you. Will you marry me?" Moved by the prince's warm words, Snow White's heart also stirred, and they promised to marry. Meanwhile, the queen found out that Snow White was still alive, and went to find the princess again. The queen secretly attended Snow White and the prince's wedding but was caught by the soldiers. The soldiers rushed to the queen and put shoes on her feet. They were shoes made of red-hot iron. The queen started jumping up and down because it was too hot. It looked as if she was dancing because she was so happy. The queen kept dancing like that, and Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after.